It's 12 o'clock. It's time for our webinar. Welcome, everybody, to Preparing Your First Podcast. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. This is the third webinar we've held this month as part of a free series based entirely off of just talking to the humans we work with and saying, what is it that you're needing or wanting to learn right now? I think a lot of us are trying to come up with new ways to shift our energy. And I'm a big fan of figuring out how we can get more creative during this time. And podcasting was something I didn't, honestly, David, I didn't expect, but we had a bunch of people come out of the woodwork and say, of all the things I'm thinking about right now, I'm sitting at home. I know that it doesn't take a ton, and I have a story I want to share. I'm thinking about starting a podcast. And so I loved this answer because I was like, this gives me the perfect opportunity to talk a little nerdy about some tech stuff and talk about what, I think makes a great podcast. And truly, I think that there is a really, really important moment here for us to get really raw and really real about the information and stories and experiences that are mattering most to us. And I think that we could all use a little more truth right now. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about podcasts with all of you, share some of our best practices, and I couldn't be more excited than to be here with David. So I'm gonna let David do an intro of himself, but first I just have to say that David and I met many, many moons ago. It's almost been 10 years.
Probably,
David,
yeah, close to it.
Which is kind of wild to think, but David and I used to be colleagues when I worked at Intuit, and our path has just done this, over the years, different tech companies, different things that we've been working on. But we've ended up into a time and space where we both have our own podcasts. Yours just happens to be one of the top 50 in the world for business podcasts. So kudos to you. And tell us a little bit about yourself, David, and what you do today and how you got into the whole world of podcasting.
Yeah, so the quickest way is I was at Intuit, so QuickBooks, for almost 22 years. I started out doing tech support and kind of moved my way from tech support into quality assurance, into product management, into development. And I spent really that last 6-7 years at Intuit building out all the apps that add on to QuickBooks. Cool. And after that, I left. I started my own company, took a job with auto entry, and I'm currently the head of accounting and bookkeeping evangelism at Melio Payments. So I'm with another company now. But in this meantime, yes, I did start a podcast, but it didn't start like, oh, we're going to launch this podcast. My co-host and I, we actually met 2 years before, and at a conference, and you have your beers and you're smashing cups, and you're like, let's do a podcast together. 2 years later, nothing ever happened.
I remember. I remember this.
So then Blake he did about 3 episodes of the Cloud Accounting Podcast on his own, 3 or 4 episodes, and he was using more like a webinar. He would record and then spin off the audio. And he had me on episode 5 or whatever it was. And as soon as I got off the phone, I said, let's just do this every week. And then we just started doing it every week since then. And we have not missed an episode since. So I think we're at 172 episodes, and I joined at episode 3 or 4.
Wow. So here's an important question I want to ask of you before we just get into the agenda and everything we're going to cover today, because I've been thinking about this a lot right now, is that, kind of the word that's coming up on our team this week is recalibrate. We were talking about earlier how we're kind of, settling in. I don't even like the words new normal, but we're settling into this realization that life might continue to look really different for all of us. And some of us, like I said, are kind of in this state of apathy, and others of us are realizing like, okay, we may have to reinvent ourselves, or we may have to recreate what it is we do during the day. And podcasts for me have been a way to storytell in a different way, and a really important creative outlet to get my ideas out. And you, I happen to know, are just as high strung as I am. So talk to me just for a second about, I know you talked about doing a podcast, but what kind of outlet has it been for you from a creative perspective?
Well, I think it's been efficient for me because I always found blogging difficult.
Okay.
It's hard to get myself into a mental state without distractions to write. Mm-hmm. Right. So I have thousands of non-finished blog posts, right? Thousands of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you just never get, they didn't ever get out the door because like there's just so much more. You just treat that creative process differently, right? You try to make every paragraph, every sentence perfect. And for me, podcasting lets me get all those ideas out of my head in a much faster, more efficient way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm not worried about saying words perfectly or having the perfect complete thought. I'm not worried about what's the perfect image to add to those words as I type them into a blog. So it's been an outlet like that. But even recently, I think, as we've gotten into this lockdown and this COVID situation and just the stresses of the week, especially accountants and bookkeepers early on in this process, all their clients, right? Accountants and bookkeepers, their clients are going under, right? They're losing their businesses, and it's been very hard for accountants and bookkeepers. And I think the 1 week was especially tough, and just Blake and I be able to connect and doing the podcast that week, it just felt like very therapeutic, right? The ability that we were able to just talk about what was going on that week it was just a good experience to have. And if we didn't have the podcast, I guess I just would have been dealing with that all weekend by myself, right? And not getting those thoughts and feelings out. So it's a good outlet at the end of the week for us to some extent.
I love that. And I think that we all need new outlets right now. And so what we're going to talk to you through today is going to be a little bit esoteric in nature, a little bit more about structure and kind of theory, but truly behind like what makes a great podcast. Because Dave and I will resist the urge to rant here, but the barrier to entry for podcasting is so little. And while I believe that like you have the right to create anything you want to create, if you want to make a podcast that really reaches people, we want to talk to you about some of the things that you can be doing from a content, from a quality, from a format perspective to really nail it out the gate. And then we're going to talk about some more of like the technical, a little bit of the nitty gritty, which I think, people don't realize, what all goes into podcasting. And having been at it for, I think we're on episode 35 recorded. We've published 21 at this point, but we've done 35 recorded at this point. We've learned a lot about the tech. We've had to re-record. We've made mistakes. And so I just want to pass on. And I know David you have a lot to share here too, of just like, what are these best practices to both, setting yourself up for success from a recording perspective, and then also from actually getting listeners on your podcast. And Dave, more than anybody's got experience here, so I'm going to really lean on him. And then we're just going to talk about takeaways. I always love giving folks, some action items that they can go away, take a screenshot of, think about. So that's where we're headed today. But here's where we've got to start, which is that, Dave, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but for me, podcasts are a labor of love. I didn't get into podcasting thinking I'm going to become a podcaster and this is going to be a whole thing. I got into it because I was looking for new ways to tell stories. I was feeling a little creatively stagnant. I just wanted to switch it up. And the format for my podcast is conversational. And so the Finding Fearless podcast, we interview women. And I was having all these amazing conversations in private that I wanted other people to hear. So I just saw podcasting as a way to do that. But you really got to dig deep. You've got to think about what is the message you want to share? And you've got to make sure that that's a message that you're willing to come back to over and over again, because nobody's going to listen to a podcast that doesn't have a core theme. So Dave, talk to me a little bit about this. How podcasting been a labor of love for you?
Well, I think it has to start out with a little bit of a love, because you just don't get a lot of action in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think you just said the slide before, the barrier to entry to create a podcast is nothing these days. If you have a phone, you download the Anchor app, and before this podcast is over, or this webinar is over, you could actually spin up a podcast and have it on iTunes.
Yeah.
But nobody's going to listen to it. That's the reality. And
your mom might. You
have to. The first 7 downloads will be you testing out every device, right? It'll be, but the labor of love comes in where it's a lot of work, and it's a drudgery work. The recording's the fun part.
Yeah.
But it has to be edited. You have to create some show art. You got to distribute it. You got to promote it. a lot of times, like for us, you have to prepare for your
Yeah.
podcast, right? A lot of times. And the drudgery work really starts to add up. And, we were 40 weeks in before we really started to see some uptick in numbers,
Yeah.
and to do that for 40 weeks is tough, right? If you're not love it, if you don't have some faith that it's reaching somebody, or it's making a difference. That's why I think a lot of people give up. They get 6, 7, 8 episodes in, like, this is too much work. And they
Exactly.
give up because they don't, you kind of have to love it and be willing to ride out the long, tough stretch.
Yeah. And that's why we want to be honest with you, is that, it's a labor of love, but I also think it's the thing about podcasting is it's going to allow you to really dig deep and ask yourself, like, what is the thing that I'm really, really meant to share? For me, I created my podcast because I wanted to dig into content that I didn't see existing yet. So I was listening to a lot of podcasts that were wonderful, and we're my kind of genre is business, a little bit of like some nerdy things, This American Life here and there, or how I built this. And I loved that storytelling model of somebody asking questions and somebody telling the story, but I often felt like the stories were inaccessible. And so, I'm always thinking about, entrepreneurship as a path to equality. And I wanted other women to be able to hear stories of women who weren't necessarily CEOs of some, mega $1 million Fortune 500 company, but were somebody who was maybe just one step ahead of where they were and was talking about, the honest truths of how she got there, rather than about, raising, big rounds of funding or something of that nature. And so, I think that the thing is you have to figure out what is this message that you're really meant to share with folks, and that, again, you want to come back even when you're 285 episodes in. So you're on what episode number, David?
172 as of this morning.
172. Would you share, how did you guys know you were on to this core story or this core message? Like, was it the audience uptick, or was it just the fact that it was something you guys never tired talking about?
I think we knew when we started just getting feedback from people that were listening in the early beginning. You have these circles of your Twitter followers or your friends or people, and they're accountants and bookkeepers in the profession. And we started hearing buzz and feedback of, hey, it's amazing. And it's great when somebody is like, hey, I listen to the podcast. You guys are onto something. You're doing a good job. Yeah. Like that's kind of was the first keys to that, but it really changed and flipped when we'd start to I'd go to an accounting conference, and I'd meet somebody, and they're like, oh, I listened to every episode of the show. I had to do physical rehab for 4 weeks, and I caught up to every episode, and I love you guys. And for people that you don't know to tell you they listen, that's where it's really amazing, right? That's how you really know, okay, we're really changing the world here. Like something's happening. Yeah. When it moves beyond the people that already know you, when strangers come up and say they listen to the show.
Yeah, and the biggest thing for me was something similar. It was when we started to see that people weren't just listening, but they were sharing it with other people. That was a big change for us, is to see how our emails, because we do a feature, I think we do them on Mondays now. So every week, we put out, an episode, and we share it with our audience along with a little bit of messaging. And we've been seeing how people are sharing, and it's great because you can watch the time block of like, oh, somebody listened, and then they were like, oh, I've got to pass this to a friend of mine. And that's really exciting to know that, something you created sparked, magic for somebody that they wanted to spread around. And part of the way I got there, in terms of format and in terms of something that really mattered to me, was just starting to think about, what are the things that I could talk about for hours and hours and hours, completely unprompted or without preparation. And granted, David shared, depending on the nature of your podcast, you might have to do prep work. Like you guys talk about a lot of things where you've got to cite your sources and be, super clear, because you're reporting a lot of times on news or updates on companies and things like that. So you've got to come with information in hand. For me, it's interview style, so I've got to do a little bit more of question preparation. But if you're on the right track when it comes to your podcast, the thing that you should be talking about is the thing that you're like, oh, we could have recorded another 5 hours about this, because it's something that really is aligned with your purpose, like the thing that you're here to share with the world in a much bigger way. So, I like to tell people, okay, don't just think about like, oh yeah, I'm going to think about starting a podcast. I tell them, think about one person who you're really trying to reach. What would you share with them? Or I tell them, okay, what is the thing you could talk about all day long? Or what is your why? Like, why are you starting a podcast? And talk about this, David, for you. What do you think was your why for starting your podcast? Was it just you guys had so much you wanted to share, or was it something deeper than that?
I think it might have been a little
content?
deeper.
Yeah,
It might have been deeper because we talked about it 2 years ahead before we ever did it. And even before that, like I went to this is 9 or 10 years ago, I found some sticker. I went to a PodCamp type event in Phoenix, Arizona, like early on when people were podcasting was just starting. Like Apple didn't even have podcasts built into their app. So really early on. So I've always liked the format and the medium. But I always, Blake and I would get in these discussions at conferences, right? And I'm just like, we should record this, right? It kind of was like that. It was almost like recording was naturally taking place a little bit. And then it just kind of evolved from there, right? It wasn't set out like, hey, let's go build a news podcast.
Yeah, it's so funny because that was something very similar for me. Is I was having, like I said, conversations in private with women about, their accolades or their accomplishments or their struggles in the world of entrepreneurship. And I was like, someone else needs to hear the story. Like somebody needs to hear the story of how you fell flat on your face and you got back up again, or how, you started your own company in your basement and you're still building it. Those were the things that really inspired me. And I think, that digs deeper into your why is when it's something where you're like, somebody else needs to hear this. That's a good sign that you're on the right track, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And a lot of it is just, if you have opinions, like I think that's another way if you write down a topic, like my podcast is going to be about X. If you can't write down like 200, just rattle off 200 things related to that you have quote unquote an opinion on, it's going to be hard to create a bunch of to have a podcast that sustains for 2 years. Right. Yeah. But if you can write down 200 things related to that topic, that's 200 shows.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. I love it. Okay. So I asked everybody in the chat panel, what is your why for starting a podcast? Because I think it's a, something that some of you maybe know already and others of you are still kind of wondering. So as we talk about passion and purpose here, I just want to hear from all of you, like, what is the thing that's calling in you? Is it something where you're just like, I want to create something new? Are you having conversations that you want to share with the world? Do you have 200 million opinions that you want to talk about and record? What is your why? And as you think about that why, I also want you to think about, who are you really trying to reach? Because for me, I had one person in mind when it came to my podcast, and it was my god sister. So my god sister, I've watched her grow up. She was born when I was 11, and I've always felt like a big sister to her. And I watched, this is pretty personal, but I watched in the fall of 2016 as she was heading off to college, and she was so excited to be a part of the big adult world, and she was going to go out and she was going to move to DC and she was going to be a trailblazer. And she got there, and instead of watching the first female president be elected, she watched something else entirely happen. And it really changed the way she saw the world, and it changed the way that she saw her place in the world. And so I was having so many conversations with women at that point in time about what it meant to be a woman in America and what it meant to be a woman in business. And I was finding hope and inspiration in conversations with my friends. And I believe that we as women could recreate the working world and continue to push forward despite all of the obstacles that were arising. And I was thinking about my god sister. I was thinking about the story that I wanted her to hear so that she would believe that she would get out on the other side of college and there would be the place and there could be a world that she really wanted to be a part of still. And so that's like who I was really trying to reach. And then as I got down the path of podcasting, I was like, I don't just want to reach her. I want to reach all the other women who feel like her right now. And so by being super specific in who I was trying to reach, I was able to really refine of all the people in the world I could interview, who did we want to interview? Of all the stories we could be sharing, what were the ones that would matter most? And then, you talk about building consistency. That's how you figure out, what are the things that you're going to share over time rather than just it being a 7-episode thing. So when you thought about who you guys were meant to reach, did that happen organically? I mean, the name helps gather the right people, but you two are both in this industry, so it seems like you guys set out with a pretty clear vision as to who the podcast was for.
Yeah, it definitely was not as noble as yours, right? Or inspirational. We definitely figured out who the audience was. Obviously, we really in the beginning were just really focused a little bit more on people that were into cloud accounting, people that liked QuickBooks Online, that liked Xero, that were really focused on small business. But what's happened is it's naturally evolved to go outside of that to where, it's tax professionals, maybe accountants that work possibly at the Big Four. But in the grand scheme of things, from like who are our audience, even I think your slide you're talking about, there's like 7 billion people in the world, right? And we get like 2,000 downloads an episode, but it's nothing. Like we don't even exist yet. If you think about there's 1.6 million accountants and bookkeepers in North America. Like we barely exist. We're barely reaching an audience as of yet, right? And so it's not that noble, but I think for us the noble part is we're really just trying to save them time and become an efficient resource for them.
And I think too, there's some of us who want to feel, now more than ever, connected to something bigger, connected to a wider story. And for me, like your guys' podcast is a great way to still feel plugged into the industry, even if I'm apart from it, even if we're not going to conferences right now, it also gives us a way to, like, anyone I talk to who listens to your podcast is like, yeah, I don't even have to open up all those browser tabs. Those guys give me the info I need. But it also really builds community is the thing, because for a lot of folks, who don't necessarily hang out with friends all day that do what we do, or don't necessarily have partners that do what we do. Like I love my husband, firefighter, super amazing guy, but I can't turn around and be like, oh my gosh, Xero, bought HubDoc, and that's like such a thing. And he's like, what's a HubDoc? And so I think for us to be able to share our passions with people from around the world, allows us to connect in ways that we haven't in the past, because it was harder to find people who are interested in talking out or nerding out about the things that we really care about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about identifying the message. This is super important to me because I am a big believer in creating what we call on our team marketing that matters. So we don't really believe in creating content for content's sake. If you're going to put something out in the world, it's got to be something that really allows you to draw people into your wider message. And so we've got to think about upfront, what is the message about? And so I think that it's important to break it down, because part of the real magic of podcasting is being consistent and telling compelling stories. And so people, return podcasts they actually want to listen to, because it's a consistent source of information. That's why people follow Dave's podcast, is because, like I said, it's the place they go to get their cloud accounting news and information. It's consistent. So topics and guests can vary, but what you really need to figure out when it comes to podcasting is, what is the overarching story? Like, what is the theme? Why would somebody want to tune into your podcast regularly? And what makes it unique and inspiring? So when I thought about all of the different podcasts out there and the things that I find to be consistent, these were the 4 things that really stood out. One is that it's insightful in some way, shape, or form. David mentioned the importance of having opinions. People want to hear from people that have the authority to offer expertise, because for a lot of us, podcasting is a learning outlet. And so we want to get something out of it. So if you're just going to wax on and nobody can walk away saying, oh, I got something out of that, it's not going to be insightful, which means people are not going to come back to it over time. A few of us in our crew have been listening to the new Brene Brown podcast. Feel free to tell me in the chat if you are too, because a lot of us are obsessed with it. And one of the things that I think is really insightful was like, I was curious to see, what would her format be? And it's very focused and it's very technical, quite frankly. Like, people don't realize it, but like, I walk away from that podcast with like, oh, I've got 3 new strategies to tackle my anxiety, and I could teach them to my family at dinner time, because she's that direct as an expert. And it's a really cool way to see her research come into play. And it excites me to have an expert like that passing knowledge on to that many people. The other thing, though, is that, in a world with, God, David, how many podcasts do you think are out there, if we were to be honest?
Oh, it's in the millions.
It's in the millions.
It's in the millions. Yep.
So millions of podcasts out there. Is yours unique? What makes it different? I know, for example, that my podcast is not the only female business podcast out there. There's lots of them. But the thing that makes it original is that we focus on what we call stories of women on the path. So a lot of the content, almost all of it that I found at the time, was stories of women at the penultimate highest tier of leadership. But we didn't have stories of women that were just making their way in the working world. And I wanted to focus on that. So that's what I see as making us really original. What do you think makes the Cloud Accounting podcast original, David? And how did you guys tap into this? Was it that nobody was doing it, or was it something deeper?
At some level, it was nobody was doing it. I mean, there are lots of accounting and bookkeeping related podcasts. All of them, 99, except for us, I think, they're 100% focused, more or less, doing interviews of people in the industry. There's maybe 1 or 2 that aren't. Yeah. And so we really round up the news. So a news roundup is really more like a service, right? Mm-hmm. An accountant or bookkeeper can listen to our podcast in 45 minutes to an hour every week, and here's all the top news that week. So we're saving them time. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's really what makes us original, is we're not doing a podcast like anybody else in our industry is. Now there's news roundup podcasts for the political news. There's news roundup podcasts for tech news. These exist. So the format's not original, but nobody was doing it for the accounting industry.
I love that. So I love that you brought in that it doesn't necessarily have to be the topic itself that's original, but what about the format can be different? And so that's something I would encourage you to play with. And I also think, it's really important to look back at, like, again, what is the content that you consume? What really resonates with you? And is there something about that podcast that's unique that, inspires you to figure out what your little unique thing is? So I will talk a little bit more about format in a second here, but I think this is really, really important, is what is it going to make it original? What is it going to make it stand out to somebody who might have multiple choices to choose from out there in the podcasting space in your genre? Now, what I think can also make it super original is if you make it personal. I think that, tying your content back to a bigger story is really, really important. And that's one of the things that podcasting allows me to do. It's been a process because, most folks knew my public accounting industry persona until I started podcasting. I was like, yeah, I'm this business development leader and I work for this company and now I've got my own company, yada, yada, yada. But on my podcast, I started opening a lot more about who I was as a mom, and who I was at one point as a single mom, and who I was as a wife, and, my personal experiences. And it's interesting to see, how this has helped me craft a message that's more meaningful even in my own business today, just by giving an outlet to offer that personal story. But I think that truly at the end of the day, we've got to remember that podcasting is people listening to the voice of other people. And so they want to hear that humanness, and not to be like, just, talking about Brene Brown all day, every day. But she, on her podcast, she gets really, really personal. She talked on her first episode about, how much it sucked to try and record her intro, and how, she was having to record in her closet. I mean, David and I are both big closet recorders, and I talk about it on my podcast. So the more personal you can make it, the more you can make it feel like it's coming from another person, the better it feels. And then the last piece is just that the content should be inspiring in nature. So, whether it has a call to action or just some way that people leave feeling better than when they started. I think that's something that folks want to either tune into the next episode or, are excited to come back and listen to more. So what are the ways that you resonate with these 4 things when it comes to your message, David? Like, talk me through this.
Yeah, we talked about originality. So, the format itself is original, and obviously insightful because we're delivering news, right?
Yeah.
And people are able to get that. I think with the personal, yes, Blake and I'll talk about our personal experiences in the industry and things like that. But I think your comment about how it ties back to a bigger story, because we'll bring in our news articles that have nothing to do directly with the accounting and bookkeeping industry, but they're related somehow, and we connect them back in. Maybe there's a lot of quote unquote the words automation, right? Or machine learning and Bitcoin and all these technical things that are kind of really tying back to the accounting industry. But we'll talk about robots breaking down at a robot only hotel, right? Even that has nothing to do with accounting and bookkeeping, but it ties back, and we can tie it back to our bigger story, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the accounting industry and what's the change that's really happening in it. As far as inspiring, that one, it's hard to know, right? I think it may inspire some people because we've gotten some messages, like we've gotten people that have left reviews because a lot of times accountants and bookkeepers are on an island, right? They have their accounting bookkeeping firm. They've just started it. They don't even know anybody in this industry. They have nobody to talk to. And to some extent, listening to us really inspires them, right? To try new things or take that leap. And so even though we're not building content specifically that's inspiring, just the fact that the content exists and folks can get it when they had no other outlet to get information.
Yeah. And I think too that part of the ways that we inspire other people is by sharing our story to validate other people's as well. So I mean, for you guys, again, that idea of connecting to a wider community and realizing like, I'm one of many people who is a part of this world of accounting, and we're all thinking about these things. And you sharing stories about AI and automation makes me question, look at myself and look at my business model and ask different things that I might not be asking if I was just again still thinking that I'm out here on my own. But that could spark conversation and connection between people.
And sometimes the opposite is true. There's sometimes things I may say on the podcast that are somewhat controversial, but usually by the time I'm saying it, I've heard it 100 times, either through text messages or private messages from other accountants and bookkeepers. By the time it comes out of my mouth on the podcast, I'm just saying what everybody else is thinking many times, right? And that's where you do get that personal connection, but it's coming from the other direction.
Yeah. And I think that's so important because people see your podcast as part of their story or an outlet where they feel like, the ideas that they have are being heard. So I think that's another thing to think about, not to get too meta here, but like tapping into the subconscious of your listener. What are the things that they're thinking about or wish they could share or wish they could say, and how could you speak those words to them? So the thing that I want you to think about is, again, insightful, original, personal, inspiring. What is the topic that's coming up for you? What is the thing that's coming up for you where you're like, I've got all 4 of those if I'm talking about this, and I feel passionate about it. I feel some level of fire. I'm going to keep showing up, all the way to episode 200. So I've heard a few people share so far, but I want to share what we're seeing in the chat, but chime in as well. So, Rabina shared that she wants to bring new content to light, and she sees people tapping into blocks right now about our own worth and value, but they're not able to go deeper and define and move through those blocks. And so she wants to really, get into this kind of space where people are feeling limited and combine and talk about soul and self and wealth and reach people to help them break through those blocks in their own life. I love that. George shared about, working with technical experts and the fact that, folks have been these leaders for a really long time and they don't know how to let go of the technical work. And he's been through this transition himself, and podcasting feels like a great way for him to share that story and help other make, smoother transitions in leadership. So I think those are both just amazing examples of people talking about, what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, and how they feel called to create something that helps other people too. That's one of the things I loved about both of these shares, is that you're thinking about how can you help people through your podcast as well. So feel free to chime in with any other examples, but if you're still questioning, that's okay. We're going to just talk to you a little bit now about some other things that are really important to think about. So we're moving a little bit from the esoteric to the more technical, because I promised that you'd be able to walk away with some real tangible things in terms of how to create a podcast. And one of the things that I think is really important to note here is that not all podcasts are created equal. Humans are creatures of habit, and that means that we want to subscribe to content that's consistent. And there's 3 really big repellents when it comes to podcasts, where people will listen one time and then they will say, I am never going to get back and listen to another episode of this. So David, talk to me about sound quality, because some people don't think this matters, but you guys I've seen you haul your gear around at conferences.
Yeah, so sound quality really matters. And the best example of this I could give would be when you see a pixelated photo.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody's seen a pixelated picture and you kind of can make out what it is, but your brain's also kind of putting together what that photo is a little bit. So now think about watching a movie, which is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pixelated photos over and over again. Your brain's putting that back together. Well, the same thing happens with audio. So when audio quality is not good, especially when it gets digitized, and so first you record it digitized over a horrible connection, let's say Skype, and then it's recorded, then it gets digitized, then it gets squashed down to a podcast. Every time that happens, little pieces of the audio bits are missing. Mm-hmm. So when you listen to it in audio, your brain just naturally puts it back together and you don't even realize it's happening. So your brain's working hard to listen to a podcast.
Yeah.
And so like we really focus on having sound quality because I know that matters. I've done it. I've listened to a podcast and I get done and you step back and I'm kind of exhausted right now. Like why is that happening? And it's because your brain's putting together all the missing audio, which you're designed to do as a human, right? If you and I are speaking and you didn't hear maybe 2 words I said, your brain might have filled those 2 words back into the sentence and we just carry on because maybe you read my lips at that time. Who knows, right? But if your brain has to do that for an hour straight of a crappy quality podcast, it's physically, mentally exhausting.
Yeah. And I felt that. I wrote, you saw my notes when I was like, those podcasts you get off and you're like, oh my God, my ears are bleeding. Like, why are my ears bleeding? Or like, you feel like your brain is strained and you don't.
I think this has a lot to do with, people right now, and I don't want to date this webinar forever, but the Zoom fatigue people have been talking about right now that's happening. It's because it's this digital audio that's not the perfect audio getting in everybody's ears.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And we're working overtime to understand. And so, if you really want to get that message across, record somewhere quiet, again, mention the closet factor, but there are lots of different ways. We'll give you some tech ideas, but record somewhere quiet, use good tech, make the investment if you're really serious about this so that you can, really control sound quality. And also, if you're recording with people in multiple places, you've got to pay attention to that because you may have all the tech and you may have really good sound quality, but you've got to make sure that if you're interviewing somebody who's not with you, that that you're leveraging the best in technology and making recommendations to the people you're interviewing. I've even when I worked with John Garrett on his podcast, this blew me away. He'll send a mic to you. He'll mail a mic to you if you don't have one, because he just knows. He's like, if the quality is poor, we'll have to re-record. It takes all this other time. Whereas I could send a mic to you, and it'll cost me a little money, but it's worth it in terms of the quality of content that they want to create. So big area to invest if you're thinking about creating a great podcast. The one that I'm a little bit intense about is format. I think this is just because I'm just such a strategy minded person. And one of the things that drives me nuts is when I listen to a podcast And every single time the format is different. And when I started to think about my own podcast and think about what I wanted to do and what the podcasts were that I liked, so I love How I Built This. And if you think about how I built this, it always starts and it's got this little segment from, the speakers telling a little bit of story. And it's the story of whoever they're interviewing. And then they launch in, and then they have, a little ways in their first sponsor segment. And then my favorite, I always listen to the very end because they do this How You Built This segment, which is so great, where they have entrepreneurs, talk about the things that they're building. But that format is the same every single time. And so, and I know it. And I know it down to the fact that, like, if somebody swears in an episode, they'll tell me right in the first, 5 minutes or less that somebody's going to swear on the episode, so I can pick a different one if my kid's in the car, but that consistency is something that we crave as humans because we want to see something as being our go-to source for something, So people see your podcast, Dave, as a go-to source. So what are the things that you've done in format to keep it consistent?
So it's interesting because we do not have a very good format from a episode format, right? We talk about, and we've talked about doing this, right? Yeah. Like we have different kinds of news that we covered, and we should bucket this and have like a thing that plays, like here's a breaking news, here's some accounting tech news, here's some app news, and like break it up in that way. And here's the reviews we got this week, let's read those, and have this like very structured format of what's the next thing we talk about. And we've tried to actually do that a couple episodes, but really our format that we have that is not a format, and that's why I think we have some magic, is I show up with all my news articles for the week. Blake shows up with all his, and we just go. And one of his articles will spring, in that discussion will spring me to pick one of my next articles. And then that discussion will lead to one of his. So we do have this back and forth format that is consistent every single episode, this back and forth. But the true format from an outline of like, here's our standard operating procedure, and we do this, in this order every single episode is not really there. What's consistent though is we're going to bring articles and we're going to bounce back and forth. And to some extent, it naturally filters out the things that aren't worth talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of this magic I feel like happens in the editing process, because part of creating a great podcast is tapping to what I consider to be flow. So flow is, a state that you find where you are just creating and you're not having to think about what you're doing. It's just kind of happening. And you talking about going back and forth between you and Blake, I'm like, that's flow. You guys are just in it. You're riffing off each other. That is where the magic happens. And so sometimes, format doesn't happen until the editing process, but I happen to know you've told me that Blake is a master editor, and maybe sometimes he clips some things out that you weren't supposed to say. And so that's a really important piece too, is that, you may find a format after the fact, or your format may change as you decide to, maybe you get a sponsor, or maybe you do something different. But one of the things that could be just so simple is, for me, I love to include a starter segment that's almost like a teaser of that telling the story. I totally stole this from How I Built This. I just loved hearing the voice of whoever, because I'll be honest, some episodes of How I Built This, I'll hear somebody's voice and I'm like, they could have an amazing story, but I can't listen to that voice for an hour. And so I clicked on a different episode. Or, for me, the women I'm highlighting aren't women where it's like, I know, that woman, but I, even though I put in the show notes, like, here's a story, about what this story is about, people, I want to give them something in the first 10 seconds where they can listen to and say, oh, this sparks my curiosity. I want to hear more of this. And so that's a consistency in format that we've made over time that I think draws people in to hear the next story and the next story and the next story. The other thing that I think makes for a great podcast is consistency in episode length and delivery here. So I failed at the delivery portion. You're way better at this than me, David, partially because we had some issues I'll talk about from a production standpoint. But to show up, when and where you say you will, if your episodes go out on a certain day, people start to expect it. That's really important from a consistency. And I also think it's really important to be consistent in terms of how long your episodes are. So I like to think about it here. It's like, when do we listen to podcasts? Well, we listen when we're like going for a walk, or when we're, driving to pick up the kids, or when we're cooking dinner. And so think about that block, and then how can you fit into it? And so one of the things that we noticed early on is, while I could talk to somebody for an hour and a half, people didn't want to listen to it for an hour and a half. People were dropping off at 45 minutes. And when I stepped back and said, oh, well, yeah, anytime I'm listening to a podcast, that's about the maximum time I have, 45 minutes. And so we started to really cut down and focus on being consistent in just delivering 45 minutes of great content. And we saw, people really start changing their listening habits all the way through to the end. So how has that been true for you guys? I know you're super consistent on the delivery thing. You're way better than I am. But what about length, time? Does it vary, or have you tried to keep it true?
It varies. We definitely started out, we were doing about a 25-minute episode. Yeah. And now we really pull the plug at about 55 minutes now. Yeah. It's funny because we were scared about, like, will there even be enough news? And every week there's no news. Like, we never run out. We always have too many things to talk about. So, but we usually try to cut it at an hour now. So that gives people, like, they listen to their morning commute, listen to the other half, and they commute home, right? Something like that. Yeah. For us, though, the one thing that's been really important is getting the episodes out every single week, because with a lot of things, you just have to show up and do it. Yeah. And Blake even wanted to skip 1 week. And I told him, like, if we skip, we'll skip 2 weeks. And then you skip 3 weeks and this whole thing dies. We just can't do it. So we pretty much have a goal. We try to record every Friday and then get the episode out by Monday morning. Yeah. Right. Sometimes, somebody's sick and we record on Saturday. Right. But we have seen where if something happens, Blake had the flu one weekend and we didn't get the episode out. It was like Tuesday, and people were on Twitter and sending us emails like, where's the episode? Oh, yeah. And we didn't get out till Wednesday. So you had but having that out and just not quitting and not missing, because it's just so easy with these things to skip once. It's like running, right? Yeah. Like, if you're jogging every day, it's great, but then you skip 1 day, then you sleep in 2 days in a row. Next thing you slept in a week and you haven't ran, right? Yeah. It's very, very similar. You just have to keep doing it.
And I think one of the things too is, like, you have to also make it your own. Like, for some people, it feels really good to do something with consistency. Like for you, it sounds like that, the Friday record is like a total outlet. And I when I was first started the podcast, I loved doing them on Wednesdays because there was something about the middle of the week. It would re-inspire me. It would, make me just feel excited because I was getting to have these conversations each week with women. At other points, we've batched everything. So because there's not really, kind of like you, where it's a timely factor. I went through a season where I was just recording a bunch of podcast episodes so that we could produce them and then deliver them with consistency. So think about your energy, and if you want to set an ambitious goal, how are you actually going to be able to attain it? If you want to get those first 25 episodes done, is that something you're going to do over 25 weeks or 25 days? It's something to kind of make your own here. But the biggest thing is really being able to deliver in the ways that you say you are for people. So if you're going to say you're going to deliver it once a week, you gotta be showing up on the Friday or Saturday, whether or not you're sick, so that you can bring it to people. So I want to talk a little bit about our best practices. And this is, the part where I'm going to get a little human and get a little personal, and Dave's going to do the same. So that's me sitting in my closet. I mentioned this earlier, but this is where I primarily podcast. I had, this idea when we moved into our new house where I was going to turn our coat closet into like the world's most claustrophobic podcasting booth. And then we discovered that we had a neighbor who has a basset hound that barks like you would not believe. And so the only place that I can really guarantee quiet in my home is in my closet, because it's behind the locking door of my bedroom, which means children can't barge in. And then it's behind the door of the bathroom. And then in this situation with clothes that happens to be perfect soundproofing. And so nowadays when I record, I drag one of my kids' bean bags in there. I do this beautiful set of my microphone up on a laundry basket, and it's really glamorous, but it's great audio quality. And I got really serious about this because my first few episodes, I ended up having to completely re-record because I couldn't even stand to listen to them, even after I got over like that whole hearing the sound of my own voice thing. And so this was one of the biggest things for me to have to learn, is to really set myself up for not just the mental space, but actually the physical space to record a really good quality podcast. So the other thing I had to learn a lot was about the technology side of it. I wanted to build a podcast that was a lot better than just, somebody recording on their iPhone. So I had to start talking to people. And one of the first things I did when I was recording recording episodes, was I was recording via Zoom. And as you know, David, Zoom has really low quality audio. And so I was doing interviews and people were far away, and I was like, I'll just extract the audio from a Zoom call. But what happened was there was glitches, and it just, my brain was doing that thing when I was editing episodes where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is hard for me to even, edit. And so I had to go out and look for some other tech. And to be honest, for those of us who started podcasting a couple years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of good stuff out there. For all of you starting now, there is 1,000,001 different solutions, some of which are better than others, and we'll talk about that. But there was a learning there about, if I was really going to do this right, if I was really going to put my time and energy into this, I've got to get some tech. And then the last one that we've really learned as a team now, because my company's got a team of us behind this stuff, is about production. So the biggest, hardest part about a podcast is producing the thing. And if you're not somebody who either wants to spend a whole lot of time on audio production, or you're not somebody who has the expertise, but you really want to do a podcast, I highly, highly, highly recommend connecting with somebody whose passion is podcast production. And the beautiful thing is there are sites out there. There are 1,000,001 people who can do this and love to do it. And if your purpose is not the production standpoint, find somebody, hire somebody to do it. And that was a big game changer for us, because like I said, I could go out and record 20 episodes, and then I could turn around and have them produced. And then my team could be able to schedule them in advance. And now we're going to have episodes that are set and ready and scheduled for the rest of the year by, I think, next week. So that was a huge shift for me that allowed me to let go of that, like, and the drain of being like, oh my God, no, now I have to go produce each episode. It also allowed me to hire a really cool producer. Fun fact, do you know the Delilah show, Dave? Like Delilah, she was like any like soft hits channel at like 11 o'clock at night. Chime in the chat if you know.
Possibly, I think.
She'd come on with her soothing tones, and you'd ask Delilah questions, and she's like on radio stations all around the country. So you didn't hear this from me, but Delilah, she sounds like she's in your local channel. She's not. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm allowed to say. And she may or may not have an amazing podcast producer that lives near my town, and he may or may not produce all of our episodes. So my big claim to fame is he's also producing Delilah all over America. And so, but that's the thing is you can literally throw a stone and find somebody who's great at podcast production. And we haven't spent a huge amount of money on it. And it's really, really rewarding to be able to actually get quality episodes out that I didn't have to spend time pretending that I was a producer on. So that was one of my biggest learnings in terms of that consistency piece. The biggest way that I stumbled was by thinking that I had to do it all, quite frankly. And that's just something that I struggle with a lot. But by being able to bring in other people, we've made our podcast so much better. And it's something that I'm really excited to do now, because I don't have that dread of oh gosh, and now I got to go produce the thing. So those are my big learnings. What would you say are your biggest learnings, David?
I mean, I think our biggest learning, we started out right away pretty much switching to Zencastr. And that's only because I experienced that through another podcast. And so I was aware that existed. But early on, we were just on Blake's blog site. It was just blakeoliver.com, and the podcast was hosted on that. And eventually we spun that onto, and I think it will get into tools on a future slide in your deck here. So when we spun that out, but I think our big lesson was the whole concept of what happens with guests.
Yeah.
Because we did do guest interviews a lot in the beginning, and we moved away from it, and really moved away kind of for three reasons. One, logistically scheduling a third person into, because it's like a meeting, right? So Blake and I, our two schedules have to match, and you have to get a third person schedule to match. So the logistics of just scheduling meetings were hard.
Yeah.
And then sound quality. You never know. They show up with their ear pods, it's bad quality. So you have audio quality problems. And then the third thing was sometimes they're a dud.
Yeah.
So that was our biggest lesson, was just this aha moment of like, oh, it's just easier if we just do the news. But then on top of that, we started seeing that in our download numbers. If episodes where we interview people, they get about 25% less downloads. And I think it's because people pick and choose who they want to listen to.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I want to listen to Madeline in this interview. I don't want to listen to Joe Schmo CPA, right? Yeah. Whoever it might be. Hopefully there's not a Joe Schmo CPA out there. And instead they'll download the episodes they want, but the news episodes, when it's just Blake and myself, those episodes get higher downloads. And so that kind of, when we saw it in the numbers, that's when we locked into more of what we were doing. Now we still do interviews. We'll do interviews at conferences, and we can talk about that later on. We talk about promotion and that in your podcast. But that was the biggest learning, was just this guest and how to deal with guests. Like that was the most challenging part. And we just decided it was too much work.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, let's take away some of the best practices. So we've talked about knowing your audience. We've talked about the fact that less is more. So we've said, you've got to know who you're supposed to be speaking through this microphone to. Anything that's over an hour is going to feel like overkill for people. So think about, how you can pare it back, and what is the core consistent messages you want to stick to in your podcast. David's talked about, you're not going to be an overnight sensation. Episode 40 or more is where things start to take off. And so really you've got to be able to stick with it. We've also talked about how polish really matters. So we're going to talk through now the equipment that we really recommend, the things that you could be investing in to really, up your game when it comes to podcasting. And you could even invest into, learning how to produce a podcast. If you're somebody who does want to do DIY it, don't just pretend like you're a podcast production person. Go on Skillshare, go on sites like that so that you can learn about podcast production, and really invest in the areas to make sure that things are polished. And, equipment makes all the difference. So as I would say, if you were training for a marathon, you wouldn't do it in your Crocs. If you're really going to go down this path of podcasting, invest in the equipment you need to be successful. So let's talk equipment here. I'm a big fan of the Blue Yeti. Dave, are you a Blue Yeti person too?
That's what I have as well.
Yeah, I can't pull it over because the cords are here. But a Blue Yeti is a beautiful mic. It's $129 or up to $149. It's affordable. You plug it in, you change your default mic, your computer remembers it. It's super easy to set up. It's got great audio quality. So by all means, this would be our favorite.
And it's strong. I've taken it in suitcases. I've taken it all around the world. You can feel that it's solid. It has some quality to it.
And there's so many, and I mean, this is the thing is about mics, is you're going to see mics that are $20 to $40. No, don't. And then you're going to see mics that are $500. You're not recording your next album, so you don't need to go into that category. We don't need to hear the ever notes of your dulcet tones. But investing in a good quality mic is totally worth it. This other one, this Sabine Tech mic, is a mic that I've been playing around with recently, that if you're a person that needs to move for whatever reason, now this can mess up your audio quality, but if you don't want a mic that's a physical mic for whatever reason, if you want a mic that's kind of more, what are they called? It's when you're on stage.
Lavalier?
A lavalier pipe. Thank you. So if you want a mic that's more that style, this one is my favorite mic. And this is also a really great multi-purpose mic because you can do it to record stuff on your computer. I've been teaching virtual yoga, and this mic has won a bunch of different awards recently from tech reviewers and things like that. So I got it to be able to have better Zoom audio quality when I'm doing my virtual yoga. And it was really, really worth the money. People say it sounds crystal clear and you can't hear any of the feedback. So it's a really good one. Headphones. Headphones are worth it. David, what pair of headphones are you rocking right now?
I have no clue. Let's see. Tascam. Something.
Okay. You're gonna Slack that to me, or you're gonna email that to me, and we'll put it in the follow-up.
I actually hate them.
Why do you like them?
I don't like them.
You don't? Okay. No, we're not going to share these.
I think the problem with over-the-ear headphones is if you buy all this stuff through Amazon. You get a microphone, you get the headphone kit, you buy all the boom arm and the pop filter. You can get these kits and you just buy it all at once on Amazon. And the headphones are actually good quality. There's nothing wrong with them, but they just don't fit my head right and they're heavy. I didn't get to try them on first. And I think for over-the-ear headphones, you probably want to try them on first because they're just, and I wear glasses and that doesn't help either. So
I went on a search. David knows this because I asked all of Twitter. I spent last year and way too much money trying to find what I believe are the perfect pair of headphones. Now, granted, this is my personal perfect pair of headphones. I had to try on and return a lot of pairs to get here. They're the the JBL headphones. I will put a link in our after the call. We do a follow-up kind of email. But for me, as somebody with a petite head, glasses, who's on, for a long time with headphones on, that's the other thing. Like, what's your wear time? Do you want to take them off after 30 seconds? But really invest in great headphones. Some people like AirPods for in-ear. I couldn't do it. Are you an AirPods person, Dave?
No. I'll even when we do remote, or we do at conferences and we record, we have over the ear. Now those are really comfortable. I don't know what ones my co-host Blake bought for that, but those ones aren't as heavy. But this one's just too heavy.
Okay. Yeah. So if you're an in-ear person, some people that I've talked to, I asked around, I'm an over-the-ear gal, but I wanted to give an in-ear option. Some people who do podcasting really like AirPods. I think it's a size and fit preference. And then talk to me about these other accessories that you've got, David.
So there's 3 things that you can get that are relatively cheap and they make a big difference. So, and I don't, do you have a boom arm or not?
I don't have one. I've been thinking about getting one.
I knew you didn't have one.
Yeah, because I'm not so close, right? You can't see it in here.
It's a little bit closeness, but then do you have it on a shock mount as well?
I do not. I have it on a desk.
And so the way I knew that Madeline did not is every time she went to move her mouse or type on her keyboard or bump her desk, I could hear it. So that's where these 3, the boom arm and the shock mount come in. They get your microphone off the desk and basically into springs, if you want to think about it that way. So if you bump the desk, like I'm bumping my desk, and it doesn't really affect the microphone. Mm-hmm. And the pop filter is these screens you've probably seen. Mm-hmm. And I am not a musician. I am not any professional, but my understanding is when you say the words you say the S sound or the P sound, you kind of spit when you say those 2 letters when you talk, and that spit comes out and hits the microphone and then will cause pops. And so that's what this thing's called, a pop filter.
Oh, so do you wash that thing regularly, I hope?
I don't think I've ever washed it.
Okay, great.
So don't
lend anybody your pop filter is what we
you buy the whole, it's like you buy the arm and a filter and a shock mount, and they literally, to have a decent high quality podcast production unit, if you want to call it that, $160 on Amazon. Like, it's not ridiculous to do this. And even our remote get up that Blake got. So we have a little box and we take it with us, and we have remote microphones. Even that, he likes to brag. He's like, oh, it's the same microphones that Lady Gaga uses. Like, he likes to brag. But even that get up for portable and everything, we don't even need a computer to record. We just record straight into this little box. Even that, and we can record an interview with up to 5 people at the same time. Mm-hmm. Even that, I think, is still under $700, $800. Do
you happen to know that kit name, or can you share it with me after the fact?
We could get that. I can get that and get that in the show notes, or
after the fact. We'll send it out to everybody. And that brings us to this recording aspect. So there's 2 sides really. Is it a recording where it's just you? I'm imagining for a lot of you this might be the format right now because you can't necessarily get in a room with somebody. Or is it going to be a back and forth? Dave's got back and forth between him and Blake. I've, got back and forth between me and somebody who that I'm interviewing. And so these are just some tools that you could be recording into. If you've got a Mac, you've got GarageBand already. It's built into your computer. You can use it to record. Something higher quality than just recording into your phone is highly recommended. There's other tools. Adobe Audition, I know, is Blake's favorite for editing. You can also record into that tool. Audacity is another free one. And then for more interview styles, there's multiple tools out there that are essentially going to allow, much like Zoom, like a conference room kind of environment where two people can get in and record separate audio streams that are going to sync nicely together. So Dave and I think we both use Zencaster for this, which is my favorite. And then I've tried Squadcast, which is same thing. Squadcast also allows for video. So if you want to have a video that goes alongside, as opposed to just the audio stream, some people like that if they want to like put the podcast on YouTube or something like that. And then Cast is also very similar to Squadcast. So these are kind of the top three out there for more interview style things. Now, on the editing side of the house, you can DIY it. I would just say that if you're going to edit your own podcast and you haven't done it before, invest in learning how to do it. Again, I mentioned Skillshare has 1,000,001 courses on podcast editing. But you can leverage the apps you've got natively, like a GarageBand, or you could, spend your money on a course and spend your money on a little bit of software to edit a podcast. I'm not going to tell you all the different, editing tools out there. You can Google it. There's lists and lists and lists. But then for paid production, I think that a lot of people don't even know what it takes to hire a podcast producer. And I've been down this path with multiple producers now. So if you don't want to edit it yourself, you need to be really thinking about asking the producer, like, what is the format that they like to work in? Whose work have they done in the past? I think it's really important to hear examples and samples of people's past work to make sure that they're delivering something of quality, because anybody can be on Upwork and say that they're a podcast producer, but you want to ask for examples to ensure that they're going to produce something that you actually want to pay them to produce. And I mentioned Upwork. That's just one of the many places that you could go online. I also think you could hire, friend, family. I know a lot of people's nephews who are pretty adept at podcast producing. So there's many ways to get a producer, and you could just start by asking your network who's somebody who does this work or knows somebody who does this work. Dave, talk to me about distribution, because I think that this is one of the ways that I was scratching my head when I started doing the podcast thing. I was like, what is an RSS feed? Why is it inside of WordPress? How is it different than my blog?
So, a podcast is a standard way to distribute, right? The podcast format is RSS based. It's an industry standard. And that's what makes it nice that all these other apps can pop up and pull in your feed, right? And your podcast itself is very scalable, right? There's no limit to your reach because of the fundamental nature of the way podcasting was designed. But if you build on Squarespace, WordPress, or a blog site, you have to do a lot of extra work for your podcast. You got to go submit it to iTunes. You got to submit it to all these places, right? You have to maintain. You just have to do a lot of legwork and work. But if you use a service like the Buzzsprout, we use Transistor, Anchor. If you use another service, you pretty much get the distribution for free, and those services create your RSS feed. They do the hosting for you, right? Mm-hmm. And so we actually migrated ours off of Blake's Squarespace blog to our own site on Transistor. When we probably looked at 10 or 15 different options before we chose Transistor. A couple of things. The reason why is A, they were really responsive on their support. B, we got just enough multi-user controls, if that makes any sense. So Blake, we could add a podcast, and Blake could invite me as a co-host, and we can invite the person that does our show notes in. And so it's not real-time multi-user, but we can have multiple people in our podcast and edit and work on it. Because a lot of this stuff, it takes a team to get these out the door, right? But before Blake's probably not going to invite a bunch of people to get in there and muck with his blog site. Right?
Yeah.
So we chose that. And then Transistor, because of that, you instantly get it. it's connected to everything else. Plus the other piece of this, which we don't think you really covered in here, is like tracking, like your downloads, and there's services that are popping up to track how many downloads you get. And a lot of those services, like you'd have to manually implement that into your blog somehow, and that's very complicated. But with Transistor, you basically paste in your ID and you get that tracking for free. So you just get a lot of free benefits by using a service like a Transistor or Buzzsprout.
Yeah. Yeah. So we still do it both ways, just because the podcast is still a part of our brand. So we use Squarespace's RSS, and then we also put it out through Buzzsprout. And one of the biggest benefits of one of these apps is that, it's great to have it on your site, because again, if people are navigating to your site and they can see the content there, it's, the same stream as like a blog. So we are able to upload some copy and people can read and listen directly from the website. And some people who don't do like an app, like my mom has never listened to our podcast on, an app. She's always listened to it on our website. Like I've got friends and family who love to listen in that way. But if you want to get it out into the world, some of us listen on Spotify and some of us listen on Apple and some of us, and oh my gosh, you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to publish on all those different platforms, as opposed to using a site like this that can just take the feed and push it out one time. And then, you'll see a lot more people start listening because they're able to access it in their pertinent places. And you brought up, this idea of downloads and getting downloads. And I don't think that should be the only goal, but talk to me about the ways in which you can spread the word about a podcast and get kind of that momentum going.
So obviously use your existing audiences, right? If you already have social followings, that's probably the easiest way, especially if there's timeliness, right? And you want to get it out there. And so we really spread word of mouth through just, social media really at first. And then we started doing just a little more. We went to conferences. We got a booth at a conference. We did interviews at a conference. We made stickers. We made shirts. We just over and over and over again, just grew the audience, right? There's no limit. It's just like marketing anything else, right? There's no limit on how far you can spread the word on this. I mean, we're actually experimenting right now with some paid ads on Facebook and Twitter. When I say experimenting, definitely like $5 a day type experimenting, very, very low. We're trying that out. And then we definitely also just do reviews, because if you have on iTunes, they'll rank the podcasts, and it's really based on how many new subscribers you get. And then there's not an exact formula, but it's like new subscribers in a 48-hour period. And then they also take into account reviews. So it's very important for us to make sure we ask our listeners to write reviews, and that keeps us a little higher. And it's just like shopping on Amazon. If you're selling a physical product, you want the reviews to stay up higher on the page, kind of the similar thing. But a lot of it is just word of mouth, spread it, and just being on social.
Yeah. And I think telling people to share too. And like you could do creative things. Some people, if it feels good to them, do a giveaway, or just like say, leave us a review, and you might hear us shout out about it on an episode or things like that. So there are creative ways to get people to help spread the word too. I also think it's really important. We've both talked about just looking at the data. What are the episodes and content that people engage in? Do we ask our audience, what was your favorite episode? Look at, when people are talking about on social media that they liked an episode, make note of that so that you can use that social engagement to spread the word even further. So, I think it's really important to think about like who would be the first people you'd want to let know about the podcast. Some of us have an audience already, some of us don't. But then also think about how would you reach more people. David shared, making stickers. He went to events. He did all these different things to really get the word out. So if you're really going to dig deep and do that, think about how could you spread the word. Wear shirts. Yes. I love it. Because people are then, what's the Cloud Accounting podcast? I love that. Okay. So I'm going to let David take the reign here, because you have more experience in the ads and sponsor world than I am. Our podcast is primarily, put on by ourselves, and we pay for it as an advertising kind of expense for our business. And we see it as a way to market and kind of share our brand story with the world. So talk to me about your work, working with ads and sponsors and what people are looking for. Because I think a lot of people think, oh, anybody can have a podcast sponsor, and that's not quite the way it works.
So anybody can, if you have 10,000 downloads an episode, right? You have to hit like 10,000 listeners. Now, but that's only true if you have a generic podcast.
Yeah.
Like if you have a podcast that's a niche audience, companies in that niche will pay to advertise on your podcast. So you don't have to have 10,000 downloads. If you, I don't know, sell, I don't even know, some unique accessories for glass. You have the Glass Blowers podcast, right? And you only have 100 glass blowers listening. But let's say there's only 200 glass blowers in all of North America. The glass blower tool manufacturers would probably advertise on your podcast, and they'll probably pay a premium. Yeah. Right. And so you can monetize a niche podcast probably a lot easier than you can monetize, oh, I'm just making a generic podcast about the NFL.
Yeah.
Right. Because then you're going to be running Squarespace ads and Casper mattress ads and all the generic podcast ads we hear on all the other podcasts is because they're paying pennies on the dollar for thousands of people to listen. Yeah. And so you can monetize, you have a smaller audience if it's niche and actually charge a little bit more, but you don't only have to monetize through advertisers, right? Mm-hmm. You can monetize. A lot of people now are experimenting with donations, right? And there's a service out there called Patreon that some people are using, and some people are they leave some of their podcasts for free, and then maybe you do a Patreon subscription to get some bonus episodes or bonus content. There's people using these different ways to gate that. The only problem with that model is they're saying at most 3 to 10% of your listeners are going to donate money. So if you start working backwards, if you only have 1,000 listeners, it really starts to trickle down really fast, and you're like, what's even the point? That's too much work. Other models that people use, it's donation, like a value for value model. Like, hey, how much value do you think you're getting out of this every week? Appreciate a donation. And every week, build that into your content, build that into your rhythm. But I think if you go in expecting just to make money on it, it's going to be, even a longer haul, right?
Yeah. And I think that the thing is again, we go back to that why. Like, it was the why to create all the money in the world off of being the most world famous podcaster, or was the why to get your story out there? Like, we also have to think about, can the podcast build relationships? Like I said, we see it as a leverage of our brand and a way to connect more personally with people. There's also like smart things that we've done in the past. We've created content from the episode. So we've used transcription services and written blog posts really easily based off of the conversations we've had on the podcast. There's also people who are getting, really creative and thinking about, how can I form affiliate relationships? So one for me is like, I talk about technology a lot, because I'm passionate about it. And so I've looked at, models of, I have affiliates that, they're not ready to spend, thousands of dollars, but they would be willing to say, hey, we'll give you, $100 every single time somebody goes out and checks out, our application and sets it up. And so there's lots of different ways you can invent here, but I would say you've got to do what feels right for you. I put this picture on here because this is a podcast ad I hate to hear. It's the Farmer's Dog podcast ad, and it's, you're listening to this podcast and it's about, some big, heartfelt throb thing, and all of a sudden there's an episode, break, and all of a sudden they're like, have you ever heard of dog food? I love dog food too. Dog food is everything that dogs eat, and I have a dog and you might have a dog, and let's talk about dog food. And I'm like, what? like again, so jarring. And so if you're going to monetize your podcast and you want to go down a path of sponsorship, think about who are the people whose brands and businesses you actually want to support. And if you don't have an organic story to connect back into that advertiser, and it's not somebody who actually is going to even matter to your audience, that's not a good experience for your listeners. They're going to just be like, ugh, another dog food ad, I'm done. And so I think it's really important to think about, if you want to go down this path, to think about who are the people you would work with. And I've had a really a list, and I'm not there yet. But when I get to that $10,000 per episode, I know who I want to go to and ask to sponsor, because they're in alignment with our brand values, and because I think that they'd be able to bring something to the table that would be interesting, relatable, and valuable to our listeners, rather than just being something random because I wanted somebody to pay me money to do an episode. So yeah.
The only thing I tack on the ads is when you start getting to ads and sponsorships, it's also more work.
Yeah.
Right. You have to maintain a relationship. You have to get them to pay you. You got to sell it. It's just more work. And I guess it'd be a learning of mine. Even though I've set up a scalable system, almost like a shopping cart, so people can pick and choose what episodes they want, you probably want to try to keep people locked in, especially in the beginning, to a commitment. Like, hey, sponsor 12 episodes, sponsor 10 episodes, because the one-offs, it's equal amount of work. So if you can get somebody to sponsor 10 episodes, pay you for 10 episodes, you record their ad once and you just stick it in 10 episodes, it's the same amount of work as if somebody sponsored one episode. Exactly. So you may want to just not even try to sell one episode. Like, hey, it's a 5-episode minimum every single time. I think because it's just everything about this is work, right? Mm-hmm. Getting ads is work. Getting sponsors is work. Even just the bookkeeping part of it is work, right? Because now you have money going through the podcast. Now you're going to do the bookkeeping. Like, everything is work. So you're just going to have to make sure it matches the value, right, of your time.
Yeah. I love that. So I want to ask you now, are you feeling ready to record? Do you have questions? Do you have thoughts you want to share? I've seen a few come through. There was a question about, what is the cost per production? I shared that I'm paying $50 an episode, but what are the questions you have left? What are the barriers that are keeping you from just being like, okay, I'm going to record my first episode tomorrow? And as you're thinking about what those questions might be and adding them into the chat panel, I'm going to just offer you some simple plan of action here. So first and foremost, is we talked about this concept of identifying the core message. What is that thing that you feel passionate and purpose around that you want to share with the world through a podcast? What is your why for podcasting? And then think about fine tuning. Maybe it's not as nitty gritty as my format expectations. Dave talked about having something slightly more fluid, but take time to think through, what do you want an end product and an episode to look like? I think it's really hard to do things like produce an episode or tell somebody to produce an episode for you unless you have an idea up front of what you want your experience to feel like when somebody's listening to your podcast. So take time to reflect on podcasts that you love and the formats that make sense to you or that feel right for you. And think through that prior to just diving down the path of recording. Then get some equipment. Dave talked about these kits. We'll share again links after the fact to all the items we mentioned. But also get a space. Create a space where you can go to do these things, because again, it's about removing barriers from being able to do the work. And so whatever you can do to set yourself up so that you have a good place to record and you feel like you've invested some money and some energy into it, that's going to be key. And then line up some production technology. So whether that's a human person or you taking a course or you buying that piece of software that you need or figuring out how the heck GarageBand works, and get some of that tech in place. Test out Zencaster, log on and leverage these software so that you can get a sense of what it's going to look like to record and produce the episode. And from there, once you've got people to actually edit and produce the thing, you're going to start sharing this out with the world. So I always am a big fan of setting a goal. So if you came on this webinar and you are committed to really doing a podcast, put a goal out there. When is your first episode going to go live out to the world, so that you can work backwards through this plan of action towards that goal? So I had one question come through while I was adding in this plan of action, and it was, what is the step between recording software and production to getting it to a platform? So Rabina's asking about, okay, I've got the edited episode. How do I get it out there? So will you revisit that RSS element a little bit, Dave?
Yeah. So if you're using a service like Transistor, right? And your editor is giving you the file, the MP3 file. And Transistor, it's just a matter of adding it. So you upload that, you upload your artwork, you type in a title, and you set the episode number. There's some fields to fill out, and then you let it go. Now, we take time to create really good show notes. I mean, you're going back to format. Like our show notes are very tight every single week, and we provide all the links we talk about, and we spend time on them. And arguably, like, who knows if in the vast majority of listeners probably never touch the show notes, but one listener, one episode, one time will be like, I need that link, and they're gonna be glad we have good show notes. So you don't even have to do show notes. You could just pretty much have a link to the episode, a title, and that's it. You upload it, and then I just say you set a date and time of when you want to go live.
Yeah.
So there's not a big jump if you use one of those services. I think it's a lot bigger jump if you have your own blog post or site.
And the reason I liked Buzzsprout in the start was they would give you a certain number of hours of uploads for free. So a lot of these, now that there's a few different, folks in this space, what would you call this category if somebody was going to Google and compare?
Podcast hosting.
Hosting platform. Yeah. Okay. So, go Google out there. There's, again, articles that are going to tell you this one's better than this one. And you can look at them. Dave chose Transistor, like he said, because he liked the support, and there was multi-user. I like Buzzsprout just because it's a really, really simple format, and because they gave us some hours for free so we could test it out for a little while before we decided to commit. And it wasn't super expensive. We pay $12 a month, and they kind of tier how much you can upload in terms of content. So, these platforms really just make it easy. And then their job is to publish your RSS feed out into the world so that it's on Spotify, so that it's on iTunes, so that it's on Google Podcasts, all those different sites. So hopefully that answered your question, Rabina. Does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap this puppy up? Feel free to chime in here. And if you have any questions after the fact, Dave and I are pretty accessible humans. So this is finding me, I put both of our Twitter handles up here because I feel like that's where we hang out the most, Dave, and where we talk the most these days is on Twitter. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to chime in the chat. But if you have questions after the fact, these are great ways to get in touch with us. This is also a link here to Learning Lab. So if you love having these kind of conversations with experts and learning new things, that's the Fearless in Training program where we do that. So you can go check that out. That's our monthly series. But I haven't seen any other questions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and call it a day with you, David. And thank you so much for coming by. It was just awesome to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I do appreciate it. It's great to talk podcasting and just in general. There's exciting because it's such a new medium. It's been around a decade, but it's a new medium, and there's so many people just discovering it for the first time still.
Yeah. So if you have a friend who's thinking about podcasting too, like I said, we'll share the recording after the fact. Let somebody else know. And thank you all for your time today. It was awesome to get to hang out with you and hear some of this inspiration that you're feeling. And I encourage you to just go out and dive in and let us know if you have questions. All right, everybody, have an amazing rest of your afternoon. Thank you again, David, for the time.